Hey everybody, mel0n here. Welcome back to another episode of the mel0n Review. Today we're going to be talking about the craziest mouse I have ever seen, the G-Wolves HTR 8K, which is also known as the Hati-S. This mouse is just absolutely bonkers. It has an incredibly unique small shell shape that is unlike anything I have ever seen. Despite its tiny size, the performance of the HTR is superb. It is easily one of the best mice I've used in 2024, and I'm honestly shocked at how G-Wolves managed to pack so much raw power into this tiny little mouse. There's a lot to talk about here with the HTR, but before we get into it, as a reminder, regardless of a free discounted unit or a affiliation with a brand, reviews here on the channel will always be unbiased. And as always, this video will be fully subtitled and timestamps will be available down in the video description. As with all mice I cover here on the channel, I will have a full teardown of the HTR 8K coming out shortly after this video goes live, so be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss the HTR's teardown coming out very, very soon. Alright, well let's go ahead and get right into it. First, we're going to talk about the HTR 8K's unboxing experience. The unboxing experience here for the HTR 8K is probably the most rich unboxing experience I've ever seen on a mouse. There is a lot of included accessories here. Now I wanted to quickly mention the packaging for the box. The HTR 8K's box is gorgeous. It has this holographic artifact across the entire box. It is easily the most eye-catching product box I've seen, hands down. Inside the box we have a satchel-like carrying case for the HTR. Inside the satchel we have the HTR itself, which is wrapped in this kind of fabric bag. We also have two USB A to C cables, one with a rubber wrapping and the second being a thicker paracord wrapping. The rubber cable is the standard charging cable, and the paracord cable is used for the forward AK pulling rate with the included AK receiver, which does have a little bit of rubber on the bottom, which does allow it to anchor itself to your desk decently well. We also have this secondary accessory package here that includes two base stickers you can add onto the base of the HTR to cover the holes in the unit. We also have a small baggie of extra skates, two sets of full-size control skates, and a set of 30 dot skates. There is also a pamphlet that gives you some information about the HTR itself. There is another accessory package that has even more goodies. Inside here we have a holographic postcard that shares the same art as the HTR's product box. We have a sheet of grip tape, both pre-cut and full size, which I'll talk about a little more later in this video. There are two included arm sleeves that are actually surprisingly good. They are palm sleeves, which works very well with the fingertip optimized HTR. We also have this metal wolf head charm that's included with the HTR, which is a really cool attention to detail. It reminds me a lot of like a Witcher sigil, which is really cool to see, and it is magnetic so you can decorate your setup with it, which is a really nice touch. And lastly, we have 4 packets of G-Wolves new lightweight clay that you can use to extend or alter the shape of the HTR to make it more comfortable for your hand size. A very unique idea, but the execution unfortunately is a little lacking, but I'll talk more about the included clay and its usage a little later in this video. Overall, an incredibly premium and kind of overwhelming unboxing experience. I've never seen a mouse that includes so many accessories, but I actually do like everything that is included here with the HTR. The sleeves particularly are a great attention to detail. G-Wolves has done a fantastic job here. One quick note here, I believe this is what comes with the HTR normally, but I wasn't able to confirm this with G-Wolves, so keep in mind that there might be some variants of what's included with your HTR if you buy one. I'm not sure if my package was a reviewer package or if these are paid accessories, so just keep in mind there may be some differences if you order an HTR for yourself. If I do manage to clarify with G-Wolves exactly what is included with the HTR, I will make a pinned comment down in the video description explaining everything if I do find that out. Now, in terms of the in-game performance here on the HTR, this is easily one of the best performing mice I've used in 2024, partially due to the performance tech inside the HTR's tiny shell, but also due to the HTR's incredibly unique shape and the weight. Since the HTR is a smaller fingertip optimized mouse, it did take me a week or so to get accustomed to fingertip grip again, but once I got accustomed to fingertip aiming, the HTR really began to shine. The shape of the HTR is easily the most comfortable fingertip mouse I've ever used. The performance of the mouse is flawless. It reminds me a lot of the experience I had in the Sora V2 and the Sprime PM1, but the HTR does have the benefit of having AK pulling rate that those mice do not have. The HTR's sub 30 gram weight makes this mouse feel borderline weightless and allows for a truly unique aiming experience. Also, because the HTR is primarily a fingertip grip mouse, this is very versatile in terms of its usage. The HTR felt perfect for every single game I tested. There wasn't a game that the mouse felt bad for. On top of all that, the software implementation is fantastic and the battery is extremely good here on the HTR. It has been very well optimized. Overall, the HTR is an amazingly implemented mouse. Despite its small size, the HTR is one of the most well-rounded mice I've tested this year, and the performance is insane for such a tiny mouse. The only downside to the mouse is that the shape is very fingertip optimized, so it will take a week or two to get accustomed to a compatible grip style, but the performance and aiming experience here on the HTR is well worth the change to your grip style. As I mentioned earlier, the overall experience here on the HTR is truly unique. There is nothing else in the market, to my knowledge at least, that delivers such a well-rounded high-performance experience in such a small form factor. Now, as I just mentioned, the shell is what makes the HTR so unique, so let's talk about that a little more next. The HTR is a right-handed symmetrical mouse. The shell measures 92mm long, 57mm wide, and 35mm tall. From the top, the HTR kind of looks like a giant strawberry crossed with a golf ball. I haven't used a mouse of this shape before, and it's unlike a lot of the other fingertip optimized mice on the market as it has a very unique rear hump, but I'll talk about that more in a moment. The upper and lower shell material is ABS plastic. The shells are available in two forms, either honeycomb, which will be slightly lighter overall, or non-honeycomb like the one I have here. The honeycomb design only applies to the sides of the HTR. The top shell will remain the same on both the honeycomb and non-honeycomb versions of the HTR. Now, the HTR shell, as I mentioned before, is very unique and unlike any mouse I've ever tried or used. Aside from its overall strawberry-like shape, the unique thing about the HTR start with the front half of the mouse. The forward half of the shell, to around where the first side button ends, is much wider, allowing for a lot of contact area for your fingers, but the shell gradually thins out towards the rear of the mouse, mimicking that aforementioned strawberry-like shape. The sides of the HTR shell are slightly inwardly tilted, which normally I'm not a big fan of, but for a fingertip optimized mouse it actually works quite well. But what really makes the HTR so unique is that despite it being primarily a fingertip optimized shell, it has a very high rear hump. This hump terminates quite far back from what we normally see on other mice. The hump is similar in concept to like the X2H, but significantly more aggressive towards the rear of the shell, while the shell shape itself is more of that like egg-like hump design that we saw on the Sprime PM1. Now you might be wondering why a fingertip mouse has a hump to it, and it turns out G-Wolves did this intentionally to help make the HTR much more compatible for smaller hands that can't use a fingertip grip on the HTR. So let's talk about this unique hump and what it does for the grip compatibility next. Now for my 19.05 by 12.7 centimeter hands, I can only use the HTR with a fingertip grip, which is expected as this mouse is insanely small for my hands. But despite this mouse being so small, I can still comfortably fingertip the HTR, but for smaller hands, this is where the unique hump of the HTR comes into play because it will vastly increase the compatibility. The contact areas of the hump will vary from person to person, but since it's so similar to the Sprime PM1, I'm assuming it's going to be a high mid-palm contact with a slight reliance on thenar and hyper-thenar contact. And because of the HTR's very unique hump, the grip compatibility here is going to be very different from what you'd normally see on a fingertip optimized mouse. For small hands, you can probably get away with palm and claw, maybe fingertip. For small to medium hands, you can get away with claw and fingertip. For medium-sized hands, it's going to be pretty much only fingertip. For medium to large hands, fingertip again. And for large hands like myself, the HTR is going to be only compatible with fingertip grip. All right, let's talk about the HTR's coating next. The HTR's upper shell does appear to have a slight coating to it. This is most notable on the non-textured area of the main clicks. To the naked eye, it does appear to be raw plastic, but to the hand, you can feel a very slight chalk-like coating that does give the shell a tiny little bit of gripability. The mouse is easy to grip with dry hands, but once your hands get slightly sweaty, the coating becomes very slippery. You can press your fingers into the shell to get a little more grip from the honeycomb texturing on the side of the mouse, but this isn't going to massively improve the gripability here. If you're going to palm claw grip the HTR, the high hump of the mouse will most likely allow you to get a pretty consistent hold on the HTR, but for fingertip grips, usage will feel a little hit or miss as the mouse does get kind of slippery when exposed to moisture. Thankfully, G-Wolves took this into account and included two things with the HTR to help with the gripability, so let's talk about those next. The first included aid to improve the gripability of the HTR is going to be the included set of grip tape. Now the grip tape sheet has a bunch of included pieces. It has pre-cut sets for the HTR shell as well as extra circular dot pieces and a larger band-aid like piece to cover the rear hump of the HTR shell to increase its gripability. The grips themselves are hexagonal-ish in their texturing. They're on the thicker side, but not so much so that you can feel an edge to them when you use them. The grips themselves have a great natural stickiness to them out of the box, and the stickiness does stay consistent over time. The grips are very easy to install, and despite the shell being honeycomb, the grips anchor themselves perfectly to the HTR shell, and you can pull them off and reapply them as needed without warping the grips, at least from my use case. The included grips also have another unique benefit of evening out the honeycomb texturing on the side of the mouse, so if you don't like the feeling of the honeycomb shell, you can cover it with the grip tape and it will feel a lot more flat, for lack of a better word. Overall, the included grips are very good. I'm actually quite impressed. Normally with stock grips, I end up almost always recommending aftermarkets as they're going to be more consistent than stock grips, but the ones that G-Wolves included here with the HTR are actually very good. You will be more than okay using the stock grips. You won't need third parties here because these stock grips actually perform extremely well. Easily one of the best included set of stock grips I've seen with a mouse. The second accessory G-Wolves has included here with the HTR to help increase the gripability of the mouse is clay. Yep, that is right. G-Wolves has developed this lightweight clay that you can use to alter the shape of the HTR to make it more comfortable for your grip size. Now, the clay itself is extremely light. Each pack weighs around 5 grams, so you won't be adding too much weight to the HTR if you do end up using this. Now, in concept, I really do like this clay idea, but in reality, the clay was very underwhelming. The biggest issue I had with it is that it was extremely difficult to get the clay to stick to the sides of the HTR. Now, I assume this is going to be a little easier on the hollow honeycomb version of the HTR, HTR, but from my experience, I wasn't able to get the clay into the shape I wanted to because I had to press it so hard into the shell it would warp the clay itself, making I couldn't really find a way to utilize it properly or at least keep it attached. Another issue is that the clay has like an oily-like residue that sticks to your hands and on the mouse's shell where it was attached. I wasn't even able to keep it on the mouse long enough for it to harden, as it just followed off the moment I put any kind of pressure onto the clay itself. In my opinion, the clay definitely needs some kind of adhesive to adhere to. If G-Wolves were to include some kind of adhesive sheet or pieces so the clay to stick to something, it would be significantly better, but in its current implementation, the lightweight clay, while being a fantastic idea, is just very lackluster. The included grip tape was more than enough to help with the gripability on the HTR, and if you really want to alter the shell of the HTR but don't want to rely on the lightweight clay, I'd recommend using something like the Soul Spacer Shapeshift grips, as they do the same thing, but they're significantly easier to utilize on the non-honeycomb HTR shell. Alrighty, now as I talked about at the top of the video, the HTR is an insanely light mouse, the lightest mouse I've personally tried. G-Wolves is advertising that the HTR, the non-honeycomb version, weighs in around the 28 to 29 gram range. They aren't advertising a plus-minus gram ratio. I'm assuming they're just using industry standard of plus-minus 2 grams. Now my HTR with the stock skates weighs in just around 29.7 grams, just below the 30 gram range and well within a plus-minus 2 gram ratio. Keep in mind that changing the stocks or adding clay to it will alter the weight, but only a slight amount depending on how much clay you use. But this sub 30 gram weight is what makes the HTR so special. As I mentioned earlier, the HTR is so light it feels borderline weightless during use. It's a wild feeling using a mouse so light, and the aiming experience, as I talked about before here on the HTR, is amazing, primarily due to the sub 30 gram weight. Now unit QC was something I had my doubts about here with the HTR, as lighter mice, specifically smaller ones, often have to sacrifice aspects of the build to meet a certain weight spec or size spec. But to my surprise, the HTR is an incredibly solid mouse. The outer shell is extremely rigid. The lower shell, despite being pretty much empty, is also very rigid. The unit doesn't have any creaking or flexing when pressure is applied to the shell. It is overall just an extremely rigid shell, which is very impressive. The QC of the HTR is also perfect. There's nothing that would negatively impact the usage here on the HTR at all. Overall, I'm incredibly impressed with the QC and the build quality here on the HTR. Despite its small size, the HTR is one tough little mouse, so big props to G-Wolves here. They've done a great job with the build quality and the QC here on the HTR. Alright, let's talk about the HTR's main clicks next. The shell buttons start as honeycomb and transition to flat plastic towards the end of the shell clicks, where you're going to be resting your fingers. The main clicks are using the same coating as the rest of the mouse, and since there's no honeycomb where you rest your fingers, the main clicks can feel rather slippery, much like the rest of the HTR shell. But one nice attention to detail is that the shell clicks do have a slight concave indent into them, so your fingers are naturally guided to the center of the shell clicks. Another nice attention to detail here from G-Wolves is that the main clicks are indented into the shell, which means that fingers aren't going to interfere with the actuation of the main buttons, which is a really nice attention to detail on such a small fingertip optimized mouse. The indentation also helps to keep the main clicks very well stabilized. There is a slight bit of play from left to right, but only if you pull the clicks, and this is mainly due to how the main buttons are anchored into the top shell, but during use, the main buttons are perfectly stabilized and don't wobble or shift at all. Now, before I talk about the switch and the feeling of the main buttons, there is one thing I wanted to note here. The main clicks do hang over the edge of the HTR shell by around 2 to 2.5 millimeters, which I found to be rather odd. I generally don't like clicks hanging out like this because if the unit is hit off a desk and happens to land directly on these overhanging clicks, there's a very good chance that the clicks will get damaged. I assume the clicks are extended like this to make the HTR more usable with different hand sizes, which makes sense, but regardless, just be very careful with the HTR. Don't drop it, as the main clicks are going to be very easy to damage. Inside, we can see that this is using a Wano blue shell pink dot switch. I'll give you a quick little sound test here of the main buttons. The click implementation here on the HTR is decent. On a scale of 1 to 10, they're about a 7 out of 10 in terms of their actuation force, slightly heavier than other Wano blue shell pink dot switches we've seen. The main buttons have a longer pre-travel than I expected, with a slight bit of post-travel, but the rebound on the main buttons is very snappy, so you don't notice the pre-travel too much. The clicks are family spammable, but again, they are on the heavier side. You may have also noticed that the shell buttons on the HTR are quite a bit longer than you normally see, taking up almost half of the HTR's top shell. Depending on the user's hand size, their fingers are going to be positioned differently on the shell clicks, so making the shell buttons so long allows for a lot of flexibility with finger placement, which is a great attention to detail. Regardless of finger positioning on the HTR, the main clicks feel consistent across the entire shell click, even up towards the middle of the mouse. Overall, the main click implementation is fine. I do wish the main buttons were slightly lighter. There were a few instances where I go to click the main buttons and the force was enough to actually tilt the mouse forward. This was on dot gates though, but it was something I noted that was a little concerning. If the HTR HTR was using a lighter switch like the Omrons we saw in the Sprime PM1, the HTR would feel perfect. Of course, the current iteration is still totally okay, and I didn't run into any major issues that affected the usability of the HTR. I just personally wish the main clicks were a tiny bit lighter. Alright, let's talk about these side buttons next. The HTR side buttons are these very tiny curved pill-like buttons. They're very recessed into the shell, so much so they can actually be quite difficult to actuate in some cases. The side buttons share the same light coating as the rest of the HTR shell, so they can be a little bit slippery sometimes, but the included grips do include some covers for the side buttons, so if you want to make the side buttons grippier and ever so slightly taller due to the thickness of the grips, you can use the included grips to fix this. The side buttons are extremely well stabilized, there's no play to them. The side buttons are positioned quite far back into the shell, so much so they're actually shaped in a way to match the tilt and the curvature of the sides of the HTR. Now the forward button is very easy to use, but the back button is very awkward to actuate due to its positioning and matching the curvature of the HTR shell. Now this could just be my use case as my hands are huge for the HTR, but the back side button was just very hard for me to utilize. Both the buttons were far too recessed into the shell to be reliable. I ended up unbinding anything I had bound to the side buttons for use in game. I think G-Wolves should definitely tweak the side buttons slightly and make them a little more pronounced from the shell so they're easier to actuate. Maybe make the back side buttons slightly taller too so it's a little easier to actuate. Those would be fantastic changes in my opinion, but again, I have massive hands, so I'm not exactly speaking for everyone here. Ironically enough, the HTR side buttons are actually using Omron blue dot switches, which is quite funny considering we were just talking about them in regards to the main clicks. I'll give you a quick little sound test of the side buttons here. In terms of the click feeling on the HTR side buttons, they're about a 5 out of 10 in terms of their actuation weight. They have an ever so slight bit of pre-travel and a fair amount of post-travel, but only if you push the side buttons in more than you need to actually click these side button switches in. The rebound is pretty snappy, and the side buttons are fairly spammable, but just as I mentioned earlier, they're just a little tricky to actuate due to their positioning and depth in the shell. Aside from the shortfalls though, the side buttons are pretty well implemented overall. Alright, let's talk about the scroll wheel here on the HTR next. The scroll wheel has a rubber ring with a slight dot texturing to it. The wheel is quite grippy and it's very easy to consistently scroll. Inside, the HTR is using a TTC 12mm encoder. The scroll force out of a 1 out of 10 is about a 5 out of 10. Very easy to scroll with very pronounced scroll points. The scroll wheel is tight enough where you can scroll wheel click without accidentally scrolling the wheel, which is a great attention to detail. In terms of the scroll wheel click, the HTR is using a pillar switch similar to the ones we saw in the Sprime PM1 and the Sora V2. I believe this is a Kale or Wano pillar switch, but sadly I was not able to ID the switch. The scroll wheel click on a scale of 1 out of 10 feels like a 7 out of 10, pretty much identical to the main buttons. The scroll wheel click has a decent rebound, but because it's a pillar switch, the scroll wheel does feel a little mushy, but the overall scroll wheel implementation is quite good. No major complaints on my end, it's very well implemented. Next up, let's talk about the sensor and the MCU here on the HTR. For the sensor, it is using a 3395 DMT6QU, and for the MCU, it is using a Nordic 52840. The sensor is an unlocked 3395 with a max DPI of 26,000. The sensor does have motion sync and angle snapping available on the sensor. It can be turned on and off via the software. And as expected due to the HTR's 8K naming, this mouse does have a max report rate of 8,000 Hz. The sensor positioning is slightly higher in the shell than we normally see, which can have some effects on the performance, but I'll talk about that in a moment. As I mentioned earlier in this review, the performance here in the HTR 8K was flawless. The 3395 x 52840 combo is a bread and butter combo that I've used many times on other mice, and I've never had an issue with this combo. Same thing here on the HTR. I had no issues with the sensor or the MCU at all during my testing. Overall, the implementation was very good and the performance was very solid. In regards to the unique sensor positioning, the sensor positioning on the HTR is higher up in the shell, lining more up with the endpoint of the forward side button. This means that depending on how you fingertip grip the HTR, there will be some variation in the sensor positioning. With my larger hands, I grip the HTR more around the lower scroll wheel region of the mouse, which means that the sensor is slightly lower than it would be if you grip the HTR more towards the front side button region. So depending on your finger positioning, there may be a slight variance to the positioning of the sensor, which will slightly impact the usage here on the HTR. It will just make the mouse feel a little slower or a little faster depending on your finger placement, but nothing that's going to massively impact your performance. Alrighty, I also wanted to briefly talk about the high polling rate implementation. Overall, my experience here on the HTR with the 2.4 and 8K polling was very solid. 8K polling was the only polling rate I had issues with, but that's because I'm running an older system, so I had frame skipping on that polling rate, but 1, 2, and 4K polling rate worked flawlessly here on the HTR. The only downside to the implementation here on the HTR is that you're locked to 1K polling over wired connection, but seeing seeing as this is a wireless mouse that is extremely light, wired use doesn't make a lot of sense here, so it's not that big of a deal. Overall, the high polling rate implementation here on the HTR is extremely well implemented, probably the best implementation of a high polling rate I've seen on a wireless mouse to date. Alright, let's talk about the HTR's connectivity next. The HTR only supports two connectivity methods, wireless 2.4 GHz and wired USB-C. For most of my testing, I utilized the wireless so I could use the high polling rates, which as I just talked about was flawlessly implemented. I did also do some testing on wired USB-C usage, which was fine, but because the HTR is so light, you do notice the weight of a cable a lot more than you do on other mice. So while wired was completely usable, it's a little weird due to the added cable weight, but overall the connectivity methods here on the HTR are very well implemented. I would just recommend sticking with wireless usage. You don't have to deal with the extra weight of the cable. Alright, let's talk about the battery life here on the HTR next. Similar to the Sprime PM1 and the Sora V2, the HTR is using a 250 mAh battery, slightly smaller than the batteries we commonly see on mice nowadays. Now, because the battery on the HTR is smaller and because the HTR supports 8K polling rate, battery life is going to be heavily dependent on the battery optimization G-Wolves has implemented here on the HTR, so I definitely had my concerns in terms of the overall battery life. Now, G-Wolves isn't advertising any expected battery life here on the HTR, but from my testing setting the HTR to 1600 DPI, auto sleep set to 600 seconds, and the LED indicator set to always on, the battery life on the HTR was approximately 110 hours on 1K, 70 hours on 2K, 40 hours on 4K, and 21 hours on 8K. Keep in mind, I did have the indicator LED on during my testing, so you can always turn that off to get a little more battery life out of the HTR. And in terms of recharging time, the HTR charges via the USB-C port at the front of the mouse and charged from about 0% to 100 in around 45 minutes just plugged into my desktop. Overall, the HTR's battery implementation is very solid, especially on the firmware side of things. It's crazy how despite the HTR having a smaller battery, it had better battery performance on 2, 4, and 8K polling rate than other 8K polling rate mice do that have bigger batteries. So big props to G-Wolves here. The HTR is one of the best power optimized mice I've seen on the market, and the overall battery life on all the polling rates is extremely impressive for a 250 mAh battery. Alrighty, and last let's talk about repairability. Now, due to the HTR's tiny size, I was a little concerned about how easy this mouse was going to be to service, but as it turns out, this mouse is actually incredibly easy to service. To open the unit, all you need to do is remove 3 tiny screws at the bottom of the unit and the unit pops open incredibly easily. It's very easy to swap the battery or service components or clean unit, which is very important considering the bottom of the HTR is hollow, so it will get filled with dust and cat hair quite quickly. But overall, the HTR is an incredibly easy to service unit, which is very impressive. As always, with all the mice I cover here on the channel, I will have a full teardown of the HTR coming out shortly after this review goes live. So if you'd like to see how to service the HTR or take it apart for yourself, be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss the HTR's teardown coming out very, very soon. Alrighty, well, there was a lot to talk about here with the G-Wolves HTR 8K. For this being my first experience with the G-Wolves mouse, I must say I am incredibly impressed. The overall performance you get here with the HTR 8K combined with the insane shape, the sub 30 gram weight is truly impressive. The high polling rate implementation is fantastic. The web-based software is also really, really well done. And the battery optimization here is the best I've seen on an 8K mouse, despite it having a smaller battery than a lot of other 8K mice. The HTR shell also allows for claw and palm grips with smaller hands, which is something super unique I have not seen before. And the overall aiming experience here with the HTR, despite not being a mouse shape I commonly use, has really, really impressed me. But despite everything, the HTR 8K is imperfect in my eyes. The main buttons are slightly too heavy in terms of their actuation weight, and the side buttons need to be much more pronounced from the side of the shell, specifically the rear back side button, as it's just very, very difficult to actuate. But these are fairly minimal nitpicks. Overall, the HTR 8K is an incredibly solid mouse, definitely something to look into if you have small to medium sized hands or use fingertip grip. If you'd like to learn more about the HTR 8K, I will have G-Wolves product pages linked down in the video description for y'all. But that is going to be everything for this episode of the mel0n review. Thank you very much again to G-Wolves for sending the HTR over for review. This is a really awesome mouse to review, so thank you very much for sending it over for me to take a look at. If you enjoyed the review and want to see more reviews like this, and of course the teardown of the G-Wolves HTR 8K, be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss any future reviews and the teardown. If you'd like to help support the channel, you can become a member here on YouTube. It is only $2 Canadian and it is the best way to directly support the channel. You can also support the channel by using code mel0n with a 0 over at MetKeys, Lethal Gaming Gear, TJ Exclusives, Potent Gaming, and a couple other retailers to save yourself some money on your orders and directly support the channel. Thank you again for watching my review of the G-Wolves HTR 8K, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n review. Peace.